for 2 hours in the constant rain from 8 o'clock in the evening until 10 on the 21st of August 1879. Our Lady consoled the Irish people and without a word gave a word of consolation for a people who had suffered much at fidelity to her and to her son. It was with her son that she appeared, but the son was represented precisely as a Eucharistic sacrifice, the lamb slain, the black cross there over the altar, and the presence adored. The only moving part of the apparition at Knock was the angels constantly encircling the Lamb upon the throne. And she herself appeared as a queen, thereby indicating that she reigned over this land, this Emerald Isle that had always kept faithful to that altar, to that Lamb, under great duress, against all the odds. And her beloved spouse, interiorized as always, not a word, just looking inwards or down. The only person apparently speaking, but we can't hear his voice, is John the Preacher, St. John the Evangelist, who has the Gospel and is preaching the Word of God. What does this all mean? It is actually Eucharistic as well as Marian, and even more Eucharistic than Marian in a sense, for the centre of attention is really the Lamb. And it happened at the conclusion of 100 Masses for the dead lost of course at that time in great numbers, without offerings, without stipends, because there weren't any. They were just too poor, by the Holy Archdeacon Kavanagh. Apparently, at the 100th Mass, at the elevation, a little girl who couldn't speak started to speak. Things began to move, and Our Lady came. But she has always been close to the Irish people, and when the sacraments could not be easily obtained, the Holy Rosary was a chain between heaven and earth, and also between souls. They were bonded. It was easier to keep the family united in prayer before the intrusion of a foreign body, the television. Now it is even more difficult. One has not one, but several televisions and means of communication with the outside world within the average family. A prayer-filled family is grace-filled and is from within protected with an immune system from what is out there. Place the Trojan horse right in the hearth, the pulpit of Satan, and you are inviting other energies and other presences, and it is difficult for the immune system of a child to know the difference. It would be far better to keep other energies out, and as long as one can, to surround the child with grace and truth, love and warmth, and human presence, which is better than any artificial one. Investing quality time in a child. It's harder, but it repays in the long run. The Rosary. Unfortunately, the Rosary is not always well said in Ireland, but there has been a reaction to that in this last generation, a healthy one. And I think of a dear friend of mine who on this very day passed into the beyond, on the very feast that meant an awful lot to him. He would organise rosaries on the move, processions of rosaries, organise them, and then, when they were well organised, and only then, inform the police. And they had to obey him, in a sense. What I used to call the oomph factor. Our dear friend Ray, who had not all that much in the way of cultural baggage, but had an awful lot of energy, goodwill, and power to get things moving for Our Blessed Lady. And even when he was dying at the age of 39, this time last year, in hospital in Dublin, he was still giving witness there in the hospital ward. He never lost the oomph. And he was about to watch online from the local parish there in Navan the anniversary mass of his grandmother, Emily, who had died on this very day the previous year. That's 2 years ago from now, when he, perhaps fetched by her, left his body and went towards that Queen also. And exactly a year before, when she was dying, what was he doing? He was at her bedside as she was petering out and singing into her ear the hymn of this very day. Golden Rose, Queen of Ireland, Lady of Knock, my glorious Queen. Many stories have come to me. I know him from what he was, but things come out of the blue sometimes when he's no longer there. He had very little. He could only do little jobs here and there in practice, painting, that kind of thing. He wanted to paint my place one time voluntarily. So he had an awful lot of money to be throwing around. But one day he came across some down and outs who really pleaded for something, and he couldn't give them much in the way of money, but he said, well, come with me, and he brought them home and said to his mother, we have guests. And the instruction was obviously to provide edibles. Another time, somebody, actually maybe the same people, wanted something in the way of shoes. What could he do? He took pity on them. He took all that he had left in his very limited credit from the ATM and paid for a pair of shoes. It is strange that on this very day, somebody in his family tree also went to glory, way back. He had his great-great-grandfather, Michael Masterson, in the trenches in the First World War. And his brother was also there, Patrick. And on this very day, in 1917, the latter also passed to the other side. But we know that he had something of that authentic, spontaneous generosity as well. He went to take a wounded poor soldier friend of his from the firing line at all risk, and dodging the bullets, he took him away from the thrust of the fire, and this poor soldier died while he was carrying him. brother Michael had already died in 1915, and he died for a similar act of heroic kindness, typically Irish. He volunteered to go to a dangerous place to fetch some much needed water for his comrades, and he was caught in the lethal fire. In 1915, it was not comfortable to be in a trench. The Germans had already dug in and prepared well-constructed trenches and even habitations, as it were, in them. The Allied troops were far more primitive compared with them, and the tactic of the German side was just to stay in there and let the others attack, and then mow them down as they did so. We have this testimony of what the trench was in 1915. The protection they afforded, these trenches, was slender, and comfort and habitability practically nil. There were no dugouts. The parapet was not bulletproof. There was no equipment. We had exactly what we carried in marching order in peacetime, and nothing else. The trench was wet. That's in inverted commas. That is, the bottom was mud. Water in the rear trench was above our knees, and in the forward fire trench about 5 feet deep. The enemy was in a well-built trench about 100 yards away. The cold, the wet, the slime, and the filth of trench life in the Ypres salient in the early months of 1915 were such as to make an impression never to be obliterated from the mind of those who suffered and survived. The parapet oozed water which flowed down in a sticky mixture of earth and water in constant rivulets. There was no getting out to stretch one's legs on the ground in the rear. There was no possibility of movement in the trenches. They were barely 3 feet wide. The men simply stood motionless in the trenches for the 48-hour tour. And on relief, they simply marched out, if they were capable of movement. There was nowhere to put down a rifle and keep it dry. Every rifle had to be held the whole 48-hour tour. Sleep was impossible. No hot food or drink could be had. No fires could be made. The sanitation was a nightmare. Empty bully beef tins were utilized, and when full, a tin was hurled towards the German line. They died in their 20s and 30s. Patrick Masterson was 37. Ray was 39. Life was short in the trenches. Life was short for Ray. But at the last breath, they were homeward bound. One thinks of many who have actually left a name in history, unlike these who will be quiet and often unnamed. But did they die in that homeward bound orientation? Did they have the oomph factor for Our Lady? When it comes to the last breath, glory becomes very, very shady. A few seconds before facing the Prince of Glory, one realizes one's truth. And what if there is a beyond? What have I done? Little signs sometimes come back. Ray's grandfather launched a white dove when they were placing him in the ground. The dove flew for a while and then flew back and wouldn't leave Ray. He perched itself as close as it could on the body. That is a link with Our Lady of Fatima, Our Lady, our Queen of the Holy Rosary. There is that story of the doves who would not leave her when they were carrying the big statue in procession, and they were completely still. The soul is rather like a dove. We can't see it go. It does move on, and then 1 second after it's shed the body, it has a clear vista. All eternity, gained or lost in one tiny fraction of passing time. One who was present in the trenches was also a great writer, Siegfried Sassoon, and he wrote these in the name of those who went on, the forgotten of history, not necessarily forgotten before the throne of glory itself. Who will remember passing through this gate? The unheroic dead who fed the guns. Who shall absolve the foulness of their fate? Those doomed, conscripted, unvictorious ones. Crudely renewed, the salient holds its own. Paid are its dim defenders by this pomp, paid with a pile of peace, complacent stone. The armies who endured that sullen swamp. Here was the world's worst wound, and here with pride their name liveth forever, the gateway claims. Was ever an immolation so belied as those intolerably nameless names? Well might the dead who struggled in the slime rise and deride this